Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give it a couple of seconds or so for everybody to connect. But thank you for joining us today for this Industry Insider webinar, Sourcepoint. Give it a couple more seconds or so just to let everybody join us this morning, perhaps coming off of the meetings and things. Right, okay, let's make a start. So hi everyone, and welcome to IAB Europe's latest Industry Insider, where we're very delighted to introduce Sourcepoint this morning. So today they're going to be discussing responsible media through the lens of privacy with a fantastic roundtable of industry experts that they've brought together. So for anyone that doesn't know, throughout September, we've been dedicating this whole month to the subject of trust and transparency in digital advertising. So last week we kicked this off with two of our own webinars. So one of those looked at data transparency, and that was with our programmatic advisor, Drew. So he's just shared a one-on-one on how targeting advertising works and who really benefits from it. And then the other was led by our chief economist, Daniel Knapp, as he presented his latest report on the wider socioeconomic and cultural value of targeted advertising in Europe. These are both available online for you to view, so we'll pop a link shortly into the chat box so you can view those in your own time if you wish to do so. And then just over the next week or so, we're going to be hearing from companies themselves as they share sort of best practices for trust and transparency in our Industry Insider webinar series. So we kicked this off on Monday with Pubmatic. So they discussed rebuilding the value chain with transparency at the core. And yesterday we continued the conversation with OneTrust, who explored how consent can be used as an asset for trust and transparency. Again, they're both available on demand, so we can pop a link into the chat box for you guys shortly, just so you can access those as well. And just in the interest of transparency, as that's what we're discussing, any of the members that are speaking in this series, there is no commercial interest attached. So it really is just an opportunity for people to share best practices in the industry and to invite some special guests along to speak as well. So just before I hand over to Justin Pearse, who is the editor of New Digital Age, who's going to be leading the session for Sourcepoint this morning, just a tiny little bit of housekeeping for you guys. So at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see there's a Q&A box. We are live, so we do encourage you to post any questions that you have for today's panel in there, and Justin will get to as many of them as they can during the course of the panel session. And we are also going to be recording this session, so you are able to view this on demand as well. But with that, Justin, I will hand the mic over to you.
Let me just turn on my video. Lauren, thank you so much. So I'm really looking forward to this today. It's such a hot topic and we've got an amazing lineup of speakers. So talking about media through the lens of privacy, and things have moved on quite a lot in recent years, and talking about responsible media, we used to talk about the supply chain and brand safety and all these things in a pure industry context and ignore the consumer who was consuming all this amazing media, but that's changed. Now we're talking to the consumer as much as the rest of the industry. So we're going to find out what the ecosystem thinks about this. We've got a lineup that really touches every part of the ecosystem. Spend the next hour or so digging into this issue. As Lauren said, please ask questions. You've got a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So I'll get to some of those as they come in. So let me introduce my amazing panelists to start with. They'll sort of appear as if by Zoom magic as I introduce them. First up, Nial Ferguson. He's MD UK and Ireland at Sourcepoint. Then we've got Francis Hudson, Product Manager Compliance Diagnostics at Sourcepoint, until recently at The Guardian. Next, Dora Michail-Clendinnen, who's Chief Strategy Officer at the Ozone project, and also been one of the most nominated people on NDA's My Digital Hero series. Fern Potter, Global Chief Strategy Officer at Hybrid Theory. And next, Katie Eyton, who's Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Omnicom UK. So hi everyone, we've got an hour. We're going to find answers in this sort of mess that's going on at the moment. Obviously, it's couldn't be sort of busier at the moment. We've got a new data commissioner coming in, the very, very opinionated Canadian, who's going to change things, I think. So the regulators are changing in front of our eyes all the time. But let's talk about what's going on now, and we'll try and find some examples of best practice, who's doing things well, who's doing things not so well. But let's kick off. So we've had this big changes going on, Katie. We've seen the consumer brought now into the conversation much more than in the past. So how's the ecosystem dealing with this change? And especially bearing in mind your job title, do you think data ethics is a more appropriate way to frame this conversation than just trying to compete and try to fit in with the regulations?
It's a good question, but I feel like I need to get the obvious bit out of the way first and just kind of state for the record that compliance with the law is, kind of non-negotiable in this. But I think it's interesting as well. So if you look at the largest GDPR fines that have been handed down to date, so like Amazon, 740 something million, WhatsApp, 225 million, Google, 50 million. What's kind of the one thing that they all have in common? It's violations of the GDPR transparency requirements, because that then kind of has a knock-on impact on a whole load of other things, including the ability to obtain like valid consent for activity. But the point that you raised, I kind of want to also explain why I think transparency compliance kind of matters from an ethical perspective, rather than just, as you said, like, right, being a tick box exercise, which I think, sometimes it can be for a lot of people. So my background is on the agency side. And for a long time, I sort of considered advertising data to be kind of harmless, to be honest. And then a little bit later in my career, I moved into a role where I got to see some of the granular data that sits behind a lot of the targeting segments that we're all super familiar with. And it really opened my eyes to like how detailed and personal some of that data can be, especially when you start joining different data sets from different vendors together. And I think now we're starting to see that come up in the news as well. And we're seeing how that data kind of comes out of the advertising ecosystem into other areas. So like we saw it in the US with that example of the bishop who was forced to resign because his digital footprint showed that he visited gay bars. And in a slightly more sinister context, we've seen it with the tracking and profiling of Black Lives Matter activists over in the US. People were using their mobile data, advertising data, to see who the people were who were attending those protests that occurred after George Floyd's murder. And I think it just sort of shows how some of this data that we kind of take for granted can have tangible impacts on people's lives. And for me, that is why the transparency piece is so important, because it's only when you understand like what data is being collected about you, how that information is going to be used and who it's going to be shared with. It's only when you actually know that that stuff is happening that you can actually exercise your rights to opt out of those sorts of things. So for me, the ethical layer is about making sure that you don't just embrace compliance with the law, which is super important, but that you embrace the spirit of the law rather than just the letter of the law. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of an information dump there, but yeah, I feel quite strongly about the transparency piece.
Fantastic, thank you. Dora, what do you think? Data ethics rather than just compliance to the law?
Yeah, I think that was all of that was just really well put, and that last point is sort of a similar way in which we think about things at Ozone. We're very much subscribers of this idea that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, and where I suppose compliance and regulation essentially give a baseline of what in theory can be done with the data and what is allowed, what is appropriate to the letter of the law. The likelihood is that where you sit, where you are positioned in the digital supply chain, Katie sort of made that point when she shifted jobs, right, and you sort of got a new perspective on the kind of data that exists. where you sit in the digital supply chain probably informs your views on what kind of or what your approach to data can and should be. And we know at Ozone that, or our approach, I should say, is that working with quality publishers and brands where the consumer relationship is critical, it's highly valued. It means that we have to think about the consumer, the sort of consumer privacy and the ethical perspective that we are essentially responsible for. It means we have to put privacy first, a privacy first approach in line with actually the reader first approach taken by many of our publishers, where they are very much focused on subscriber benefits and building an environment that is of the the best quality. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that there's a WFA paper called Data Ethics, the Rise of Morality in Technology, which is actually just really worth reading if you like that sort of thing.
Thank you, Dora. Fern talked about data ethics, and obviously, way back when we started off the industry a long time ago, data ethics certainly wasn't a thing. It's the opposite sometimes. But how is this conversation changing with your clients, and how is data ethics becoming a reality rather than just purely lip service?
It's very different, Justin. I don't appreciate the way back comments. Obviously still youth.
That's just experience.
I know. Look, echoing what Katie and Dora said, and it is a kind of a popular culture reference of Jurassic Park, isn't it? The Jeff Goldblum line is like, they were so busy focusing whether they could, they didn't sit and question whether we should. And I think that is maybe like the entrepreneurial spirit of media and ad tech and everybody that's part of that supply chain. So it keeps things interesting. It's a fascinating time to be going through this change, because as you said, the shift has focused into the consumer and how we actually interact and how we make, I think there's a lot more focus on how we make advertising better and more valuable and make privacy and the internet perhaps as a whole a safer, more fun place. But for me, I've not met Katie yet in person, and hopefully I will, because the fact that agencies now have a role around, chief ethics and data shows that we're making inroads, that we're really changing the mindset. It's not just that tick box exercise. It's about how do you come together as a culture to help shift the way we work. Essentially, it is a bit of a behavioural change. So I find that fascinating, and I think ad tech needs to catch up a little bit there to be able to. Hybrid theory, we're completely transparent, and you have rigor in place in terms of the partnerships and the data that we work with to evaluate the transparency and the way we work with privacy. However, that's not always the case, and I think there's definitely work to be done.
I think it's definitely not always the case. That's why we're talking about this today, and transparency is the subject. But it's been 2 years or over 2 years now since that sort of infamous speech from Mark Pritchard talking about the murky or fraudulent digital media supply chain. So why is transparency still such a big issue 2 years on from that? Niall, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I had to sort of, whenever you sort of mentioned that would be sort of touch on this, I had to sort of go back and remind myself about what Mark had been saying and how significant it was at the time. And I think the 5 points that he was talking about was elevating quality, so brands being judged by the company they keep, promote civility, so looking for partners who handle freedom of expression in a certain way. I think the world has been an interesting place over the last 2 years, so I think Mark didn't expect it to be that way. Therefore, the challenge around that, sort of definitely impacted that action point. To kind of level the playing field around cross-platform media transparency and measurement, how about brands taking control? So P&G were talking about how they were sort of doing more first-party data. We've seen business doing that, but obviously, Sourcepoint are a privacy technology company. So the fifth thing he talked about was simplifying privacy, and I just don't think we have yet. And then I think he talked about 27 states in America, 27 different kind of state regulations in America, the patchwork of regulations that are across the globe. Even within GDPR, we see evolution of challenges there. So that desire for transparency and common sense simplicity, it's really hard when it comes to the privacy space, because P&G might be able to influence. So obviously Mark was talking about what P&G's position was, what they might be able to influence. And they could influence the way media owners kind of act, but it's hard for them to influence the way governments standardize regulations. So I think that is a challenge. And obviously we've seen UK GDPR coming along. I know we're going to touch on that. Is that going to simplify things for the digital market ecosystem? Is it going to complicate things? Because we might sort of do something different. So transparency in a world where privacy is kind of challenging, is difficult. I think things have definitely moved on some layers, but when we look at it from a privacy point of view, and I think just picking up and connecting it to the previous point about data ethics and the more regulatory side of things, and I suppose we're all in Europe. GDPR kind of means that there's not a difference between those two things. I mean, regulations are regulations. We can't pick and choose what we do or what we don't do. But the data ethics conversation, if it's separated from the regulatory conversation, which I don't think it should, but in the US, there's definitely, we talked to a lot of our partners out there, CCPA's arrived and they try and align themselves to that. But a lot of other things that do, they're sort of, the driving force has to be an ethical position. So I think I think from Mark's point, I don't think privacy has evolved to a point where there's this global sort of kind of view. There's definitely a global need, but I think to be able to get to a point where we're all on the same kind of level playing field will take a lot of time. And for that, I think we just have to then rely on ethics and how we're engaging with our consumers and the trust that they expect from the ecosystem.
Fantastic, thank you. Francis, we'll talk a bit more about this later on, about your move from obviously media owner to tech company. But what have you seen in terms of how the conversation changed around the move from just compliance to ethics, and also this idea that how we move past these massive issues that were highlighted a couple of years ago on transparency?
Yeah, no worries. So first of all, I think that GDPR, when it came in, it kind of acted as a bit of a wake-up call. So, I think that need for compliance is there. But I think that at the moment, we have an ecosystem that is not incentivized on privacy and ethics necessarily. It's incentivized more on, commercial gain and, bringing advertisers to users rather than, looking at their privacy. And so I think that sort of the need for compliance is essential in that world, but I think the need for ethics is still there, because as we've kind of seen the evolution since GDPR, we've brought in kind of rules and frameworks, but all of these rules and frameworks are still subject to kind of gaming. And from what I've seen working kind of at Sourcepoint and previously, there is such a differing, standard between vendors and partners in the ecosystem that right now, I don't think ethics and the right people understand necessarily the difference between right and wrong. And that I think that really we need to come together as an ecosystem to really define what is good and bad. And then in terms of the topic of transparency, I think that there has been progress made. I think I will give some credit to the ecosystem. In like the IB Tech Lab, for instance, have brought out initiatives like buyers.json. All of these things are kind of enabling publishers, brands to kind of understand all of the partners in the supply chain, but they answer the who and not the how. And I think that, privacy as a topic within transparency, I think Niall touched on this, that hasn't really come up yet. And I think we can see that from the Sourcepoint side. So we basically will, emulate real users to understand all of the things that are happening with the technologies on their browsers. And we've uncovered some really interesting differences in how people are interpreting the regulation. So I think privacy needs to be front and center.
Love that phrase. The ecosystem is not incentivized on privacy. Definitely not the case. Fern, everyone's mentioned GDPR to a lesser extent. Let's talk about GDPR. I mean, GDPR was meant to incentivize the ecosystem on privacy, as Francis says. So what's happened with GDPR? It's meant to help. Has it helped, or has it hindered sort of overcoming all these challenges we're talking about?
Look, from a personal perspective, as a customer, as an audience, I think we went through this kind of process of banning pop-ups and interstitials. I think it's made the internet a bit more of a poorer experience when you're browsing around. I think the consensual cookie consent boxes, I think there's happening about that now as well, as to how that might alter. I think from a regulatory perspective, it needs to happen, but I don't think. Perhaps we are a little bit in an echo chamber where we understand what it means from a legislation perspective and we understand what it means for advertisers, but consumers don't really perhaps understand, day-to-day people that are shopping and browsing the internet don't really understand what they're signing up to, who then has access to all their data and information, and what GDPR can do for them. So I think there's still a lot of ambiguity for consumers around how their data is used, what the value of that data is. And also the kind of experiences that come with consent versus opting out. And I'd like to see a lot more education that's consumer first, people first, not in this echo chamber, that can really kind of demystify GDPR and to understand how people understand what the journey is, especially as it evolves so quickly as well. That's it. I mean, from my own perspective, I've downloaded all my data points, from Amazon and Google and Facebook. You can see all the data points they house on you, and it's vast and it's absolutely fascinating. I encourage everybody to do the same, because you then get an idea of exactly the persona that they can build on you without actually knowing your name. And I think it's a bit scary. So I wonder if more people were doing that, if that was a bit more mainstream, that there'd be a better understanding of how important GDPR is to protect people, to protect businesses from liability, but also to, as I said, make advertising a bit better, the internet a bit of a better, safer place. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Thank you. Dora, what do you think about, the efficacy of GDPR, and on Fern's point, do consumers really understand it? Is it being demystified enough, or do they even need to, really?
I think that GDPR scared everybody into being compliant, rather than them doing it because they valued the relationship they had with their customers. It's a nice story. You can sort of then tell the story about how you care about your relationship with customers after you have been forced into doing something. You can sort of reverse engineer your narrative once you've had to do something based on regulation. And I think that overall there is a huge amount of work still to be done around this point. Do I think that generally regular people understand GDPR? To an extent, probably yes, because it does touch aspects of our lives that I hadn't even considered. In the early days of GDPR going live, we were, as I guess to the point about the echo chamber, so focused on what it would mean for our 9-to-5 jobs, the things, but now we have to fill in forms. My daughter just started nursery, and I had to fill in a GDPR consent form about how her data will be used. So the regular person who is not in our industry is forced at least to read things and sign their signature. I think that's what's interesting, is that that's probably better understood when it's on a piece of paper and you have to physically sign something, rather than reading something that is digitally put in front of you, and you sort of have to move it out of the way to get to the content. I'm going to read a quote from the new ICO Commissioner, John Edwards. So he said, "People are not equipped to read complex privacy policies and make decisions, and our brains are not neurologically wired to understand the trade-off of the short-term benefit that they are being offered against the possible long-term consequences that they are unwittingly signing up to." I think that's really interesting. And I wonder what will happen over the course of the next few years based on that premise.
Definitely. I love that example of the primary school, because I have the same thing with my daughter, and the GDPR form is such a constant thing.
Yeah.
Katie, what do you think about this idea of, I mean, really it boils down to, do consumers understand the value exchange that we'll talk about in the industry? Do they get it? I mean, is this clear enough to people?
No. in a simple answer, I don't think it is very clear. I mean, to be honest, working in the industry, sometimes I think it's pretty difficult to articulate the value that consumers get from the vast array of intermediaries that now exist in the digital advertising system. You know, I think it's very difficult to explain that, given the level of complexity and the sheer number of people that are involved. And you know, I was thinking about this when we started looking at some of these questions, and I do feel like that we could do a better job of explaining to consumers what the value exchange is, but also what's happening to their data, you know, when it goes into this ecosystem. And I'd love to see something in the TCF or other frameworks where we're actually presenting people with an explanation of, you know, this is how this stuff works. This is what programmatic advertising looks like. This is where your data goes. This is what you get back, so that people are able to make, you know, a more informed decision around some of these things.
Niall, what's your view? Obviously, you work with almost every publisher across the globe, and without wanting to, you know, shine the light on particular ones, or please do if you can, you know, how are publishers going about this process of helping the consumer understand this value exchange on which everything depends?
Yeah, I think over the last few years since GDPR arrived, I think publishers have, within the ecosystem, publishers I think have been the ones that have really gone to the time, money, effort to be compliant. There's obviously revenue kind of side of things, but we've definitely seen them understand the value that comes with being privacy led and how they're communicating that to the users. I think they definitely want help to push that further. I think value exchange is the conversation around value exchange is going to be so important for publishers, because if they want to keep their content free to users, which I think is such an important thing for all of us, for society in general, then that conversation they have about how that content is being provided for free is really important. And I like whenever we hear about how the ICO and the new process is trying to simplify things, brilliant. You know, I think brilliant. The more simple we can make it, the better. We see what Apple have done with regards to how they've presented their app tracking transparency stuff. I think there's a bit of nudging towards whenever it's capturing data for them, they call it personalization. Whenever it's capturing for somebody else, it's called tracking. I think that's interesting in itself. But I think they're one end of the spectrum where it's one line of copy explaining what's going on. Things like the TCF or multiple levels of kind of copy explaining what's going on. There has to be something in between. And I think it all comes down to the consumer again. And I think the one thing, whenever the Sourcepoint team, we have been through all the iterations of the transparency consent framework. I think the third iteration just has to be have the consumer at the heart of it. And if there's a way of easing that communication, but still legally compliant to regulations, and then having a technological approach to making sure that you don't have to consent every third visit, which is something, I think there's a lot of progression around that. Then I think we'll be in a good place. But I think consumer at the heart, simplicity and common sense being kind of a key driving point, but naturally sort of answering the regulations is going to be an interesting kind of matrix to connect, if you know what I mean.
Fantastic. Lots of questions coming in, so I'll turn to some of those quite soon. So thank you so much. Francis, can I get your thoughts on this issue of how can publishers do this better? I'm a loyal Guardian reader. I think the Guardian does it quite well. When you were there, did it quite well. But what are you seeing in terms of sort of best practice and merging that sort of thing for making sure that we're clearly getting this value change across?
So I'm actually going to answer this in a different way, which is that so data is relational, and that means that the value of data is dependent on the quantity that you have. And so understanding the value of the data exchange that is going on is really dependent on the value that the users are getting back. And so I actually think the platforms can do a lot more here to educate, you know, if we think about Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, you know, these companies amass huge amounts of data. And I would say, you know, I like the advertising that is there because, you know, you understand that there is that value exchange going on. But I don't think that that is inherently explained to users. And therefore, you know, as a knock-on impact, you have, because they have such a dominant effect in the market, I think that, you know, the smaller premium publishers, you know, who are always trying to, you know, gain market share over these companies, struggle to do that as well. And therefore, I think I'm going to bat it back to them to do a better job.
So yeah, it's all about responsibility, I guess. We've got publishers, advertisers. We'll talk about advertisers in a bit. Advertisers, publishers, tech platforms like yourselves, and then you've got trade bodies. So who has the most responsibility here? And again, who's doing the best job? The IAB are sort of always doing a lot of great stuff, I think. But Dora, who do you think should take responsibility for this, and who's doing the best job?
I think that publishers, as the custodians of consumer data, have to do the job that we've just been describing. They've got a responsibility to keep their customers or their readers' data safe. That's the first thing. And the you know, the more premium end of the supply chain, they do that, and it's a huge focus trying to get these things right. There's a question here about can advertisers do more? Should they do more? I think the answer is yes, because they hold the purse strings, and the advertiser relationship with the customer is obviously just as important as the relationship that the publisher has with the customer. But the reward for good behavior doesn't necessarily go to publishers who are doing the most in terms of consumer privacy. The reward goes to those that provide the cheapest route to the outcome required for advertisers, and ultimately that's a problem. It's a problem that premium publishers will continue to face unless advertisers make different decisions about how they spend their brand money. So I think that there is a key point in this whole supply chain that ultimately starts with the advertiser, and then being able to set the standard for where they would like their money spent and what that says about their own brand values and what they believe their relationship should be, and their responsibility, their civic responsibility should be in this point.
Okay, I point about civic responsibility. I'm taking a quick question from the audience, and remember you can ask your questions, little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, because I like this. It sort of relates to what we've been talking about. I'll read it out. KPMG recently surveyed 250 director level or higher execs at medium-sized companies and found 30% admitted how their own companies collect personal data, sometimes in an unethical manner. So the question is, what does the panel think about the fact that a third of companies are still just trying to get around the privacy regulations? And let's get the thoughts of Fern on this first.
I mean, it's a fascinating fact, to be honest. I'm not sure that I'm shocked by it. I think it's not so much getting round, it's perhaps not having the proper process, policies, understanding of technology, legislation in place. I mean, we've had a data privacy officer in place since 2018. They've worked with us on regulations across every market that we enter, making sure we're monitoring those adaptations. Dora mentioned before as well how different platforms and different publishers have different ways of work and responsibility. So really kind of optimizing the supply chain across and how you operate, and having a real rigor in evaluation of the partners that you work with. I guess not all companies have got that in play. So perhaps it's more of, I'd like to think in a positive light that they're on that journey, that they're kind of moving towards that there's definitely an expectation that they would comply. But perhaps that's then also me just like rose-tinted glasses thinking that everything's a wonderful, wonderful place. But we've got to remain positive. I'm not that shocked by the figure. And I think as well, from a broader scale perspective, and we've touched on this already, just as our business is revenue focused, is KPI focused, which generally looks at the commoditization of media and how we get better, cheaper, faster, bigger scale at a cheaper cost. Whilst those KPIs are still in play, I think we're going to find this, because it's a race to get on a plan, to get that reward, as Dora mentioned, of investment, whether you're a publisher or a platform. And that's sometimes going to mean that the way data is collected or used is perhaps not as ethical as it should be. But I love this idea of the journey started, that people are taking it more seriously. 1 in 3 is not great, but at least 2 out of 3. I guess you can say that. And perhaps bringing, into your partnership evaluation has to be a piece on ethics and values. The partners that you work with, you create a trusted marketplace throughout your supply chain to really understand how data is collected, used, aggregated, and how it's consolidated together. So making sure that we're all kind of responsible for working with the right people. Perhaps that will start shifting these people out. Hopefully that makes sense.
Just jump in, because the interesting thing is, if you look at that KPMG study, I wonder if some of it's driven by the fact that people don't think they're going to be fined. I think as the further you go out from GDPR, has enforcement, we know the ISO have been distracted by COVID and issues there. We know the resources are such that maybe they can't go after every indiscretion. But so I wonder if the lack of enforcement, other than the platforms, we see the big platforms quite rightly sort of being challenged a lot, but maybe the lack of enforcement is part of that, maybe. And then just kind of just pick up on sort of the point about what could help as well, and to encourage people. So it's almost like the opposite end of the spectrum, to encourage people to put kind of privacy practices in place. And I think it is there has supposed to be a reward to it, and I totally agree with Dora's point about, we know the efforts that premium publishers have gone to comply, using sort of the TCF frameworks, etc. I think they're obviously getting the trading value from sending consent signals to their partners, but it would be great if they were also able to see revenue coming from advertisers in a way that they're choosing those premium publishers because of their privacy practices, and actively not choosing publishers who don't have privacy practices in place, which is kind of, a few people have quoted things, but going back to Mark Pritchard's thing, when he talked about simplifying privacy, and he talked about how P&G were choosing partners, the quote was, they wanted to choose preferred providers are those who adopt common and simple and responsible privacy practices that reinforce consumer trust. And I'd love to think that P&G have diverted revenue towards premium publishers, or publishers who have got privacy at the heart of their operations, and they've seen benefit to that. So enforcement one end, kind of a reward at the other, I think, is the way to achieve something.
Thank you. Katie, you were nodding a lot during both Dora and Niall's comments, and turn to you to talk about the advertiser perspective, because obviously you spend your life dealing with clients, and although the KPMG study wasn't maybe not talking about advertising particularly, it's talking about brand spend and brand view and then the ethics of their data. So what are you seeing in terms of advertisers shifting mindset on this, potentially doing what Niall suggests, rewarding publishers for their own privacy ethics?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, definitely for us, auditing but on both the publisher side and also on the sort of tech and data vendor side has become enormously important this year. I think the ICO in the UK explicitly kind of called out the fact that you can't just rely on contractual assurances when it comes to things like programmatic advertising. You actually need to audit the suppliers you work with, and they were really explicit about that. So for us, like helping advertisers to audit both data partners and publishers has been a really big focus. We've got our own solution on the data vendor side, and we've been working actually very closely with Sourcepoint on the publisher side of that. I'd love to see more advertisers doing this, because it's amazing when you start to drill down the variation you see between the people who are doing it well and, you know, the people who, yeah, I mean, there are without a doubt people who either have literally no understanding of what GDPR is or are willfully ignoring it. I mean, there was one example I saw recently of a data vendor, I won't name names, using the transparency and consent framework, clearly completely wrong, but not seeking consent for anything, including purpose one, setting the cookie, declaring every other purpose under legitimate interest, and then saying they're also doing some device matching and a whole load of other things on a website which is clearly going to be classified as special category data. So now that's not a problem with the TCF. That is a vendor clearly going against all of the IAB's policies in that area, as well as obviously all the requirements of e-privacy and GDPR. But, you know, you've got that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got people who are really, you know, making a substantial effort to do the right thing. And I 100% agree that, you know, we need to see more spend shifting towards the people who are doing this well. And I think, you know, from some of our sort of more enlightened clients, we are seeing that beginning to happen now. But I think we're at the beginning of that journey, and I think we will absolutely see more of that over the sort of months to come.
So when you say you're more enlightened clients, but there's still a journey to go on, what's going to speed that journey up? What's going to make this process faster?
This is where some of those questions about enforcement, I think, are going to be interesting to see where that goes. I think it has been very slow in terms of regulatory enforcement. I think when GDPR first came in, everybody was panicking. There was lots of, right, we must do things. And then kind of nothing happened for a while. And I think, you know, a lot of the work that the ICO has been doing in the ad tech space, a lot of that has been behind the scenes. There hasn't been a huge amount that has been publicized so far. We've seen vendors maybe quietly pulling out of the market, but we haven't seen so many kind of public statements. And I think that's lulled people into a bit of a false sense of security. And I suspect that may start to change later this year. I suspect we will see some more announcements, you know, both in terms of some of the platforms and vendors in this space. And I think that might potentially make advertisers sit up a bit more and pay more attention to some of these issues again.
Thank you. Francis, let's turn to you on this, talking about, you know, how advertisers can understand the ethics of their media buys, I guess. And obviously, again, you've come from The Guardian, you're at Sourcepoint, so it's a really fascinating position. So what have you seen? How can this conversation change brands?
Yeah, so sort of echoing Katie's points, I think what has sort of fascinated me, and, you know, obviously moving to Sourcepoint, is really investigating and getting under the hood of what exactly is happening in the ecosystem. And I think there's just so many weird like examples of privacy. I think Katie touched on one there. There's, you know, vendors that are setting cookies for, you know, 10 years. You know, this is clearly in breach of GDPR. And, you know, the product that we're building aims to kind of unravel some of that stuff and empower publishers and brands to kind of be able to audit what their supply chain is doing in a lot more of a easy, tangible way. So going back to Dora's point earlier around, you know, we need to follow the money, and my point earlier being like the ecosystem is not incentivized by privacy currently. I think, you know, where brands can really step up here is creating some of those ethical practices around their media buys and being able to kind of audit and apply that to the partners they work with, so that you have this knock-on effect of, that third of companies that aren't compliant really having to step up, because otherwise they're going to be pushed out of the ecosystem. So yeah, I think there's kind of 3 key areas. I think, brands can, where you buy your media matters. We've seen health websites with big brands appearing against them with no consent frameworks, no privacy policies, obviously clearly in breach. I think understand who you partner with, but also who are your partners' partners, like who are the vendors that your partners work with, and also speak to your partners about what their ethical practices are around data privacy. How do they audit their supply partners? I think that's really key. And I think the last thing is to set some KPIs around this, and to sort of continue to measure some of these privacy aspects on your campaigns.
Thank you. Fern, how does those things resonate with you, and things like cookies being set with a 10-year expiration date and this crazy stuff still going on? I mean, what do you think, how can brands navigate this if this stuff's happening under the hood? How can they make sure they do put data ethics in place for media buyers?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. What Francis was saying, it's so fascinating. And I think there's the knowledge gap. There's a training and a process gap that needs to happen up and down companies. So we touched upon, Mark Pritchard's approach to how he wants to work with partners and vendors. But when we've still got planners in market looking at media KPIs that are incentivized on, bigger scale, because we're post-pandemic, a lot of competition for a minimal kind of pool of disposable income across all the verticals in terms of spending. So because that's happening, I think there's a bit of an offset. There's this vision of this is how we can get there, but the practical application and the techniques and the action plans, I think it'd be fantastic if we had a Katie in every kind of part of the supply chain in every business, but that's not going to be entirely possible. And you might find the 10-year cookie thing, again, maybe my rose-tinted glasses, but is that intentional? Has that been something that just does not understand or does not have the training or the somebody to consult with within the business or externally to be able to get things right? So I think that's on all of us in every part of the supply chain to make sure there's dedicated resource, or there is a program that is set in place that enables all of the teams at every level to understand the implications of what they're doing. If you look at the role of the CMO, it's broad and vast, right? And part of it might be to update a website, and that might go to the IT crew that might be in a certain part of a business that sits separately to compliance or not really had that communication. Right? You can't always be sure of organizational structure, but this has got to sit across every part of a business and be educated in that way. So that's what I was kind of thinking. I think more frameworks adoption, but real focus on dedicated training programs within brands, advertisers, publisher side. And I'm sure there's some that have that in place that perhaps we can kind of steal with pride off to make it a little bit more straightforward.
Definitely, thank you. Dora, what do you think about all these points? I mean, do you think you need a Katie in every company? Do you think the frameworks are in place? Is training missing? What does need to happen, especially to educate, both publishers and brands around data ethics in media?
I would certainly get behind a Katie in every business across the supply chain. Absolutely, that would certainly clean things up way at a way accelerated pace than it's probably realistically to be expected. I think that there are many competing priorities for businesses today on both the demand and the supply side and everything in between, and the if I can call it, the luxury of having space to create your policies around this is something that not everybody has when we are in the situation that we are coming out of this pandemic and into whatever post that looks like. Business are sort of businesses are struggling, and there's a labor shortage, and you know, all of these things. And so I think we have to be a little bit realistic about the sort of realities of those competing priorities. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that actually, long term, whilst your main priority might be revenue, that revenue is probably contingent on you doing the right thing in terms of all the things that we've just been describing. I don't think we can continue to ignore the consumer, the sort of slow consumer wake up to the way that their data is being used. And there will be a reckoning point at some stage for everybody who is doing the wrong thing. And I think that they'll wish that they had got on this track quicker. And that's what I think.
Fantastic, thanks. Lots of fun pick there. I like that you had all these big macro factors, and actually companies have enough to worry about rather than focusing all there, and without the luxury of space, as you say, to develop these policies. Niall, what are your thoughts here? You know, do companies under a huge amount of pressure from the economic, you know, headwinds facing them, have they got really time to find the space, as Dora talks about, to develop these bulletproof privacy policies?
I think if the reward is there, they'll definitely do what needs to be done. If the penalties are there, they'll definitely do what needs to be done. And I think it's naturally on, you know, it's on us, Sourcepoint, and companies like us to help on that process, to try and make it easier and to comply whenever there is kind of changes, that those changes can be managed quickly and easily. And that's definitely, you know, Fern and the product team at Sourcepoint are definitely working hard to do that. But also, we know the IAB have got programs in place, like the Global Privacy Program, that's trying to help. You know, if there is this patchwork of legal requirements across the globe, then there's a way to simplify it. So simplifying it from how we can support the ecosystem is really important. And that's something we're very passionate about, so that partners who work with us have that trust that as things change, they don't need to rip out their dev plans for the next 10 sprints just to get like a different kind of privacy piece of technology in place, that it's already there. So I think that's key. But I think it does go back to that kind of, it has to be, it's the ecosystem value exchange. It has to be worth their while. Otherwise, they will start going, well, as long as I'm not the one that gets caught out, then as long as I'm moving a little bit faster than the person behind me, then maybe I won't get caught out. So the reward and maybe unfortunately the penalty just have to be there.
Fantastic. Now, we've talked a lot about different things, GDPR, etc., consumer trust, the value exchange, and this also does depend a lot on the overall regulation. So we do have a new information commissioner coming in, John Edwards. He's vocal about his sort of, hatred is the wrong word, but just taste for big tech. And, you know, he did a big interview recently to the Telegraph talking about the need to get rid of these annoying cookie pop-ups. And so change is coming. It's the G7 meeting soon. I think it's with his predecessor. So how important do you think it is for a new information commission to come in and reset the privacy rules and regulations and approach from the very top? Fern, how important is this move going to be, do you think?
I think it's fascinating, and I love the emphasis that we've got on having a reset and being more audience focused, as we've talked about throughout the topics of the conversation today. I think it has to come back to how our consumers are interacting with privacy, how they understand it, making sure that, as I said, we make kind of the internet, or make data more understandable and a better place, and hold people accountable for the actions that they take. The interesting thing about the big tech mention, where he's a little, you know, maybe not as overzealous as we all are in terms of that usage, I think it will really help shift the conversation into the value exchange between brands directly with their consumers as well, from an advertising perspective. So really being able to look deeply at personalization and maybe understanding those guidelines around personalization, that take the emphasis off the likes of using intermediary platforms like Facebook that have, or you know, Google and Amazon that have really decoupled the brand relationship with the consumer, and therefore, you know, this is where, you know, there's blurred lines between data control and privacy. So I think the shake-up's welcomed, and it'd be interesting to see, as I said, from a consumer perspective, what challenges that brings to the rest of the supply chain.
Great, thank you, Fern. And Katie, I mean, he has talked about the fact that maybe regulations should only apply to high-risk cookies. So all these things could be over-ended in the next 12 months or so. How welcome would that be to you to get rid of this quite, I mean, draconian, some would say, regulation around cookies?
I think, yes, they have said that as part of the proposal, but I would just say, as a quote, he said also really clearly that those new options would not permit, quote, organizations to use data in privacy intrusive ways without the consent for the individual, including for invasive tracking purposes, micro-targeting and real-time bidding. So I think there's been a lot of press around the simplification bit and the not needing consent, but I think that will only apply to a very small subset of the things that people currently get consent for. The other bit, which seems to have not had as much press in the government's consultation, is the proposal to increase fines for e-privacy violations to become in line with GDPR, which would effectively put the maximum fine for failing to comply with cookie regulations up to 4% of global turnover, if that goes through, because it's only a consultation. But that would certainly, I think, get people to pay a bit more attention to their consent notices. I mean, for me, I think the problem actually is not so much with the regulation, it's with the fact that people aren't adhering to it. I think if we could simplify the process in the way that the regulation kind of requires, like giving people accept or reject all options on the same first layer of a notice, actually that would make it a lot less intrusive for a lot of people. I think it's some of the ways people have been trying to get round the regulations that have actually caused the frustration in a lot of cases. Whereas if you follow the spirit of what the GDPR is trying to do, I think it gets you to a much better place for the consumer.
Perfect. Now, I think we're about to wrap up any second now, so I'm going to hand the very last word on this amazing panel to you, Dora. Are you optimistic that this new commission coming in? Are you optimistic that things can change for the better, or will they remain the same?
I'm always optimistic. I think that he came in and he said that he wanted to do what's right for the UK people. He talked about some kind of third way, where he sort of described a sort of rather heavy-handed approach that GDPR has been taken to in the UK versus the US approach, which is very much focused on, I guess, centralized digital innovation and sort of allowing for that to flourish. So he's talked about this sort of middle spot. I don't know what that's going to look like. You know, who knows how that could evolve, but what I do know from, and this is why I'm optimistic, is that our industry adapts, and it adapts really quickly, and there's some brilliant innovation that's come out you know, across the globe. And so I think that with the right approach to ethics and using technology for good, that we will continue to sort of find ways that we can, you know, both do the right thing and also make exciting products.
Amazing. Well, that is an absolutely beautiful way on which to end. So thank you so much to my amazing panelists. It's been an incredible way to spend an hour or so. And now I'll hand over to Laura to say goodbye.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Justin, and to all of our panel. There were some really good discussion points covered in that session. Also, just a flag, as we've kind of shared in the chat box, as the managing organisation of the TCF, we've actually just launched a vendor validation process. You can find a link to the blog post there, but this really follows the CMP validation process we launched back in 2019. And the aim is really just to identify and enforce against instances of non-compliant vendor implications, so which may reduce consumer protection, expose vendors and publishers to legal risks, and even undermine the reputation of the TCF in the eyes of both regulators and users. So just take a look at that blog, and obviously reach out if you do have any more questions around that. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this session, so it will be available on demand and it'll be on our website later today for everyone to re-listen into if you wish to do so. But yes, thank you again to Sourcepoint and our great panelists today, and Justin for leading the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all in our next session, which we are doing tomorrow with Criteo. It's a later time of 2:30 p.m. CET. So please do check out the website and join us for that as well. And with that, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.